Well, good morning. You're just in time for more great stories and a little bit of cozy horror with me, Dr. Plague. So come on down and join us for some wonderful stories and some wonderful times. Let's start things off strong with a classic. Talking about a strange arcade in a foreign land that might have a little bit more than Frogger and Mario. Let's hear a little about Your Corner of Hell.
Hey, folks, and welcome to the show. It's your dude, the unconquerable Wafflesaurus Gamer. Today, I've got a real treat for you. As far as jobs go, flying free to Japan to edit footage was pretty good. I'd been the other half of my best friend's YouTube channel for nearly 2 years now, his dedicated editor and sometimes cameraman when the need arose. Travis, or Wafflesaurus Gamer, as he was known on YouTube, had a fairly popular Let's Play channel, in which he played everything from the shiniest new games, to the oldest retro titles, to the most ghastly train wrecks the internet has to offer. He had a modest fan base that seemed to like his Logan Paul-esque style, and the guests he had from time to time were entertaining enough to hold the attention of an 8 to 25-year-old demographic. 2 weeks ago, though, someone had sent him a weird one. The guy claimed to be from the outskirts of Japan, said he and his brother had gone to a game parlor with a reputation for obscure titles. They had gone to play a game that had been stirring up rumors in their little town, a game called Your Corner of Hell. The writer said very little was known about the game, but some kids in the village were supposed to have gone crazy or killed themselves because of the things they had seen in the game. The two had, of course, wanted to play this mysterious game. The owner had heard their request, money had changed hands, and the guy and his brother had been invited to the back of the arcade to play the game. The older brother had gone first. The room had a one-occupant rule, and the younger brother waited for a while his brother played for what seemed like hours. We went into the arcade at 10:30, just as they opened, but my brother didn't come out of that room until well past dark. The younger brother had sat for around an hour before boredom brought him back into the arcade. I spent several hours playing the machines, down to the lint in my pockets, and still he hadn't come out. As the sun went down, he heard a commotion near the front. The owner was carrying someone over his shoulder and shouting at the younger brother to get lost. The owner shoved him from behind, his meaty hand moving him easily. When the younger brother was on the sidewalk, the owner had tossed the thing that he'd been carrying onto the pavement and shuttered his shop up for the night. The thing he had been carrying turned out to be the boy's older brother. He was unconscious. The doctors say he's in some kind of coal mine. He may never recover. The owner denied that he'd ever even seen us, of course, and he has some kind of connections that keep the police from investigating him too closely. I know you play weird games, and I hate to bring you into something like this, but could you please go and try to find this game? The man at the parlor will let you in the back if you tell him Lilith sent you. Please, if you can find out what my brother saw, maybe they can help him. And now, here we were, standing outside the shabby arcade. We had flown into Hiroshima and taken a train out to the town of Tomonoro so we could meet the younger brother, a 15-year-old named Hisu. He recounted the tale to us as we sat in his mother's kitchen and drank some strong tea. The boy's hands had trembled as he spoke, and he seemed on the verge of tears as he retold his story. My parents are at the hospital with Ichi, praying that he will recover. He was supposed to go to university this year, but now it's unlikely that he will ever recover. The kid's English was pretty good, but when Travis asked if he wanted to come with us, I didn't need words to read the terror on his face. I haven't been back since the incident. I won't go near it again. A lot of kids in the village won't go there anymore either, not after what happened to Ichi. He wished us luck and said that he would pray for our return. Standing outside the grungy arcade, I didn't see what all the fuss was about. The facade was filthy, ivy hanging from the canopy, and bars installed over the dingy windows. The dust on the windows looked like you could have written in it, and the spiderwebs in the corners looked old enough to have seen the Reagan administration. The door was a black, gaping mouth with a roll-down shutter that would lock at night. As we stood, I could hear the beeps and plinks from inside, the familiar sounds of Pac-Man and Street Fighter, and the sounds were comforting somehow. Even in this foreign land, the sounds of familiar games could bring me comfort. "So, got everything hooked up?" I asked, going over his setup one more time. His glasses were set up with a pair of digital recorders that were damn near undetectable. As he recorded, the camera feed would be continuously uploading to the cloud. I could pick through the footage later and edit it into something usable for the channel. Since I couldn't come with him, he would have to record his events as he saw them. I was mostly on location to call the police if anything weird happened. A few local kids may not pique the police's interest, but an American tourist with 500,000 sub count might make them a little more willing to investigate this place. It made me feel like a real reporter, working in the field to expose the truth. How quickly we forget that those people, too, can die. It's as ready as it'll ever be. Let's see if there's anything to see, Travis said. A big grin spread across his face. We walked into the building that was awash with blinking lights and a cacophony of sounds. Children of all ages were hunkered over the blinking machines. Others were running around and laughing as they tried to find their favorite games. I could hear the wooden chunk of a skee-ball machine, the metallic clink of an air hockey table as the puck zipped around the smooth surface, the hollow boom of a shooting game, and the pop tunes of Dance Dance Revolution. The owner had a modest collection of classic arcade cabinets as well, and even at a glance, I could tell that this was a place that made money. Standing behind the counter, looming like a monster amidst the brightly colored prizes and flashing signs, was a giant, grinning man. He was easily 7 feet tall, and nearly as wide. He had an oily mustache that sat under a bulbous, greasy nose, and his eyes were like a mean-spirited pig that loves to snap at curious children. He reminded me of a picture book I had owned as a child, Puss in Boots, and how the ogre had made me feel scared. The warty ogre had sat on his cushion in his beautiful clothes and looked down at the cat as it wove its lies. Even as a child, I had thought the look made him look menacing. It was a look that said plainly the cat was in danger of being devoured. The man spoke to Travis in what I assumed was Japanese, a language I was not familiar with. And Travis spoke back to him with relative ease. The man smiled, showing several blackened teeth, and spoke to Travis in English, though this English sounded more like European than actual American English. "Ah, an American. So word of my special game has spread that far, eh?" "Infamy more like it," Travis said. The man's smile looked a little off after that. "You'll need to sign a waiver if you'd like to play. After the last incident, I really must protect myself from further accusations." Travis scanned the document, looking for traps, and I asked the owner about the game. "What is it that seems to be making your customers react so badly?" "Well, there are the usual rumors that surround the game. The creator died, his spirit haunts the game is actually a portal to hell. Many strange rumors surround my little shop, but I can assure you that the game is just a regular game. Nothing special that need elicit such reactions." Travis had finished signing the paperwork and was ready to see this game. "Only one of you at a time, boys. You'll have to wait out here," he said, pointing a dirty finger at me as Travis stepped behind the counter. The last time I saw Travis, he flashed me a peace sign and smiled with a big grin. "See you on the other side," he intoned. Then he disappeared into the shadowy back room as I remained in the world of flashing lights and familiar sounds. I turned away from the counter and found myself drawn by the brightly colored lights and the machine's electronic blare. I spent some time playing familiar games: Tekken, Marvel vs. Capcom, Time Crisis 2, House of the Dead. I took a spin at Initial D, a very intuitive racing game, and had my ass handed to me by a local kid at Street Fighter 2. These same kids then talked me into playing Dance Dance Revolution with them, and I had a blast as I tripped along to several of the fast and bubbly songs they picked. I lost track of time for a while, enjoying myself, enjoying the company of kids half my age who didn't speak a word of my language. When a shadow fell across us, though, their smiling faces curdled, and they scattered like birds. I looked up from some unpronounceable game that hadn't made it to America, and found the owner standing over me, 2 large men flanking him. He looked angry, his face wooden yet still smiling, and he told me to get my things and leave. I was shocked. Was he kicking me out? Had I violated some unknown rule? I had easily spent $50 in this place, and the idea that he was here to pull me out made no sense. I'm here with my friend, the one in the back. I'll leave when he finishes his... He's gone. He broke a costly machine and left out the back. Now I want you gone, too, before I call the authorities. Wait, I stammered. Which way did he go? I'm a stranger here. I don't know any... but it seemed they weren't here to negotiate with me. The two large men had me under the arms in a heartbeat, and before I knew it, I was half drugged, half carried from the shop. They deposited me onto the sidewalk with a distinct lack of grace, and the owner stood in the doorway as I got up and stood with confusion. "You and your friend are banned. Leave the premises before I call the authorities," he said, evenly, before slamming the shutter down in my face. That's how I came to be outside the dingy shop without Travis, half a world from home with no clue how to get back. I had no choice but to walk to the Hisawa residence. He was the only person I knew in Tomanoru, and without knowing how to speak the language, I was practically helpless. Hisawa spoke English, Hisawa knew the area, and Hisawa knew the people that lived in the village. Hopefully one of them could help me find Travis, and I could get him through whatever was going on so we could get home. Also, Hisawa had a computer, which I would need to find Travis. Travis had gone to the back wearing the glasses. The camera on those glasses had been uploading to the cloud for the past 5 hours. If I could link up with the cloud, I could watch the video he had uploaded and get some ideas of where he was going. That would allow me to find him and get us both back home. If only it had been that easy. Hisawa, it turned out, wasn't home. His house was locked up, and the lights inside were dark. He had probably gone to see his brother in the hospital, and as dusk began to set, I made my way back into town. I was looking for somewhere, anywhere with Wi-Fi, to access the videos on my phone. It wouldn't be as stable as accessing them from a dedicated connection, but if it helped me find Travis, I didn't care how I went about it. It was getting dark, and I started to worry that I wouldn't find him until morning. When the familiar arches of a McDonald's came into view, I breathed a sigh of relief. They had Wi-Fi, and after purchasing some food, I was pretty hungry after not eating all day, I plopped down in a booth near the back wall and made my way into the file program. The file was there, but the program had stopped updating about 20 minutes ago. That was weird, but if he had wandered off the signal range, it could be that the program couldn't get a connection anymore. I clicked on the file and got 6 hours worth of video. I gasped. Surely I hadn't been in the arcade that long. It didn't feel like I had been in there any time, but my stomach was empty, and I had been known to lose track of time when I was playing games. I ate as the file finished downloading. I had finished my food when a message popped up that the files were ready to view. The video began as we walked on the sidewalk. I heard myself asked if the equipment was working okay. We walked inside, spoke with the owner, and I could hear myself asking questions as Travis looked over the paperwork. He signed, followed the guy into the back, and turned suddenly to treat me to a last look at my worried face. "See you on the other side," he intoned, before turning back and walking into the dim back room. He walked past a line of overstuffed shelves to a hallway with several closed doors. Some of the doors had shadow lights beneath them, shadowy forms doing God knew what, but the man led him to a particular door and opened it with a key. Inside was a sit-down cabinet similar to the old joystick arcade games. The cabinet filled the room, and there was barely enough room to enter as Travis stepped inside. "When you're done, lock the door as you leave," the man said, his almost European tone still hanging over his voice, not like the angry one I had gotten as he threw me on the sidewalk. Then he closed the door, and Travis was alone with the softly glowing screen. The screen was large, 50 inches at least, and the words "Your Corner of Hell" pulsated across it. Travis looked for a coin slot and found none. He sat down and grasped the joystick, a single piece of plastic with no buttons or triggers. He looked around for a start button. Travis spoke to the audience, telling them that this was the game that had garnered all the hype, and he was going to see what all the fuss was about. He had just said something about not finding a start button when the screen emitted an odd static noise and bathed the room in a harsh white light. Travis snapped his eyes forward, and I had to shield my own eyes against the bright intrusion. Then the screen darkened, and Travis was staring at a bleak landscape of reds and blacks. He moved the joystick, the screen panning around, and it became apparent that he was in a cave. Travis praised the graphics, walking up to the wall and inspecting the textures. I had to admit, it was very impressive. The renderings were far beyond anything the cabinet or the screen should have been capable of. For a second, I could swear the pictures on the console were real-time. The cave walls were made of dark stone with veins of red that wound through them in arteries. The walls pulsated and moved oddly, and when he turned, there was a dim light coming from the end of the tunnel behind him. Shapes moved in that light, strangely proportioned shapes, and Travis seemed hesitant to go in that direction. After a few seconds of half-heartedly looking around, though, he discovered that this was the only route and moved his character down the tunnel. Kind of basic for a game with such well-defined graphics, but whatever, Travis grumbled as he moved up the pulsating tunnel, viewing the weird rocks around him. I heard him gasp when the tunnel roof gave way to the sky, and my own breath stuck in my throat at the sight. The sky was a deep red, the red of heart's blood, and as he took it all in, I could see bodies falling from it ceaselessly. They fell close, they fell far away, and the ones that fell close to the cave splattered on the ground with sickening realism. Travis jumped back, startled as the realistic gore splattered across the ground, and I heard him use a word that would have definitely got us demonetized if I wasn't going to edit it out later. I reached for my earbuds as a family lumbered past on their way to the bathroom, the squelching making my stomach flip over a little as it erupted again and again. I didn't want anyone to hear these sounds. Hell, I didn't want to listen to these sounds when it came right down to it. As I slipped my earbuds in, I heard Travis mumbling about the level of gore as a body landed a few feet from him and burst like an overripe fruit. He seemed more intrigued than angry, though. Then, as Travis watched the body, it got up. Its limbs popped grotesquely back into place, and the naked humanoid, bald and sexless, got up and stumbled away from the site of its landing. It ignored Travis, stumbling across the dark sand that covered the ground. I could hear Travis breathing hard as he watched, and after some hesitation, he followed it. It stumbled across the sand, jumping as the hot sand burned its feet, and as it traveled away from the cave, Travis could see it joining groups of other battered bodies. They didn't speak. They grouped out of pure instinct and shuffled along as the black sand gave way to sluggish rivers of living fire. The group seemed to shy away from the fire, and I really couldn't blame them. Something seemed to be moving within the flames, and the group of bodies seemed to know that it was something that wanted to hurt them. Travis followed them, but never joined their group. He seemed to understand that these skittish creatures, humans or not, would be a target for whatever lived here, and their group would attract a lot of attention. As if to prove that point, one of them strayed a little too close to the fire and was ensnared by an arm of living flame that dragged it into the fiery river. The group looked after him, marking his departure, but they neither mourned him or slowed. They kept moving, and I could see other groups moving similarly as Travis used the joystick to look around. "What in the hell is going on with this game?" Travis asked as he followed the group at a safe distance. Am I supposed to follow them? Am I supposed to strike out on my own? I don't get the point here. He decided to follow them, despite their lack of direction, and as they neared a field of sharp black grass, I saw a creature jump out to challenge them. He was average height, his skin a deep maroon, and somehow he reminded me of the shopkeeper at the arcade. He was as wide as he was tall, and he looked at the group with a broad smile on his face. It was a distinctly gobble-you-up sort of smile. It spoke to them in a strange language, completely ignoring Travis as he moved in for a closer look, and some of the creatures stepped forward hesitantly to stand near him. The rest stood their ground, unsure of the stranger or whatever he was offering. It didn't matter. The nets came flying from the grass then, and the creatures yelled in a very human way as they were captured. Some tried to flee, others were resigned to their fate, but none of them tried to fight back. They were sheep, and soon they would be rounded up and taken to wherever it was they were bound. They made piteous noises as the nets fell over them, which seemed to push Travis to action. Travis rushed at the creatures, yelling at them to get the hell away, but since he possessed no weapons, he attempted to run his body into them and stop them from taking the struggling humanoids. He bumped the creatures, foundering against them, and the creatures took no more notice of him than an ant. They had the group rounded up in no time, and when they walked into the grass with their prize, Travis followed them into that sea of blackness. Maybe I'm supposed to follow them, he said, his voice a little frantic. Maybe that's my goal? He moved into the grass like a blind man, losing the creatures almost at once. When he came out, he was alone in a dark world of black sand and endless miles. He traveled into the emptiness, unsure of where he was going. He moved aimlessly, the hellscape never changing, and the falling bodies never ceasing. Travis didn't follow them anymore, though. He seemed to think it was pointless, and as he moved deeper in, I could hear his breathing becoming frantic and unsure. The game was presenting him nothing but a vast world to explore, but he seemed unable to interact with it or alter it. There were no trees to punch, no shelters to make, no goals to accomplish, and the only constant seemed to be the moans of the falling bodies or the distant screams of the unseen. The screams would erupt distantly, sending Travis turning frantically in that direction before returning to his chosen path. He had seen no one but the creatures and the humanoids they hunted, and he was becoming a little paranoid of the big open landscape. Travis began his journey into emptiness with some commentary on the landscape, the graphics, and the game's strangeness. The farther he went into the wasteland, the more addled he seemed to become. He talked less to the audience and more to himself. At first it was just idle talk, wondering if he was going the right way or not, but slowly his speech began to descend into mumbling. The screams were starting to get to him, and I was worried that he might be losing it as his camera panned around for what felt like the 1,000th time. I fast-forwarded a little bit. His trip through the wasteland made up almost 4 hours of the total video. When he had stopped in the desert, staring at a fixed point for several minutes, I started the video and returned to his heavy, labored breathing as he stared into the distance. He sounded ragged, as though he had been slogging for hours for real, and he just stared into the distance for no reason, intent on something. Suddenly he ran towards whatever he was seeing. The camera footage was secondhand, and I leaned in as the McDonald's crowd bustled around me, trying to see what he was seeing. Whatever it was had excited him. Whatever it was had piqued his curiosity. He ran like a man possessed, stumbling in the game as he made his way over the shifting sands towards whatever lay beyond. When the first tree of the grove came into view, I thought I knew what he had seen. When I saw what was hanging from the tree, I wondered why he was in such a hurry to get to them. The grove of dark and twisted trees came looming up from the spinning air. They weren't tall, maybe 8 feet, but each of them bore a length of rope that swung from its branches. At the end of each rope was a sexless humanoid. As Travis got close, I could see the purple bruises around their necks and the boneless way they hung from the dead trees. The grove was nothing but these grotesque wind chimes, and Travis seemed less eager as he walked into it. When the first one started screaming, I cried out right along with Travis. It came as a sudden eruption in my right ear, and my sudden yelp made a couple across from me frown and look at me oddly. I apologized, turning back to the video to see Travis studying the poor creature as it twisted on the noose. It grabbed at him, speaking in a strange language that might have been English once. It held its arms out to him, pleading for relief, or for release, or something, and Travis backed away before bolting. The forest came alive then, the tortured screams and shaking trees erupting into a cacophony and fury, and Travis began to run frantically amidst the swinging horrors. He fell suddenly, tripping over a root, and when he looked up, I heard him sob audibly as his eyes fell on a single, withered humanoid. It might have once been female, but as it was, its chest was flat, its crotch smooth, and its head hairless and lumpy. As it lifted its searching, begging face to him, I could see a single half-moon scar on its cheek. She screamed and wailed just as the others had, but there was a deep longing for release in her eyes. She begged him with her eyes, cried at him with her wailing mouth, and Travis could do nothing but stare at her as she wailed into the void. "Mom?" he breathed, his voice shaky. Travis had lost his mom last year to cancer. I had known her all my life. She had made Travis and I snacks after school, drove us places in our teens, and Travis had always been so close with her that she became like a second mother to me. How many times had I seen that scar on her cheek and wondered how she'd gotten it? Her face was still as sunken as it had been in the hospital as she lay dying, and as that screaming face stared back at Travis, I saw him snap like an over-tightened guitar string. His fists came up, and he slammed them into the screen. The cabinet shook, the image shivering, but Travis was far from satisfied. He slammed his fists, he kicked his booted feet, and he screamed like a wild man as the cabinet jerked and bent under his assault. How had I not heard him? How had I been feet away, having the time of my life, while my best friend had gone through the worst trauma of his? How had I not heard him screaming? How had I not heard his fury? As the cabinet sparked and broke, I could hear him screaming the same thing again and again, and it broke my heart to hear the pain in it. Mom! 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 The door swung open, and the arcade owner screamed at him, wanting to know what he was doing. Travis rushed the man, his smile now an angry gnash of teeth, and shoved him out of the way as he made a break for the back room. He turned to look at the store owner, and for just a moment I could see the faces of those creatures that had captured the humanoids. His gnash of teeth looked like the beast's frozen grin, and I could almost hear Travis coming to the same conclusion. He bolted for the back door, and I saw him run out into the dingy alley. He looked around frantically, people on the street staring in mistrust, before taking a left turn and heading in the opposite direction we had come. He ran up the streets of Tamanaru, a stranger in a strange land, and the people on the street gave him a wide berth. He was frantic, moving like a wild animal, and when he stopped suddenly, I leaned in close to see what he was looking at. He stared, seeming to stare at his reflection in the window across the street, and the people diverted around him as he just sat there, staring. I could see his small reflection in the glass, and he looked haggard, crazed even, but his face was filled with that unhinged understanding that you sometimes see in the mentally ill. "Mom," he whispered, and without warning, he rushed across the street with the blare of car horns following him. He ran up the street, never slowing, and when he came to a familiar train station, I wondered what he meant to do. He kept calling for his mother, chasing her ghost or something else that only he could see, as people moved out of his way like he might be contagious. He ran through the platform, the rustic wooden benches looking spooky in the near dark, and the people in the loading area cried out as he jumped down onto the track. I wanted to turn away, fearing what would happen next, but I owed it to him to see his end. The train came rolling up, blowing its whistle. He ran towards it, shouting her name. "Mom! Mom!" The train whistle blared, and the people on the platform screamed. "Mom! Mom!" The train lights rolled in close, a blinding corona of light in the eyes of the camera. "Mom!" Everything went white, and then suddenly dark as the video ended. I sat back, stunned, unsure of what I had seen or what I should do. My best friend was dead, a victim of this game that I still don't understand. I watched it secondhand, so maybe it doesn't have the same effect on me, but that's little comfort in the face of my friend's violent departure from life. I have nothing now. I haven't just lost my friend, I've lost my job and my means of returning home. Travis had our tickets in his bag. He had our hotel keys in his pocket. And I'm sitting on the sidewalk of the closed McDonald's now, unsure how to proceed. I don't know what Travis saw in his last minutes of life, but I pray it wasn't his shrieking mother that hung from the skeletal tree of that damned game. All I can do is tell my story and hope that some of you will have answers. All I can do is warn you not to play this game, as enticing as it may seem. Travis would want his death to mean something. He would want his sacrifice to be more than just another Let's Play or a creepypasta. I pray that if the land in that game is real, Travis didn't become one of those falling things that came from the sky. If there is a God, I pray that he took him somewhere better. Transitioning to another favorite hobby, we go from video games to some hiking and cave exploring. Though, I can assure you, the cave exploring is impromptu at this point. So let's learn a little bit more about what happens within the circle. I like exploring. From state parks to virgin wilderness, I love being out and seeing things. I used to go alone a lot, just communing with nature and really roughing it, but thankfully on the day in question, I had someone with me. Jake hadn't wanted to go, had said he had a bad feeling about it, but I insisted. Jake is kind of a shut-in, and I thought that some fresh air and sunshine might help him come out of his shell. Plus, it was spring. Who doesn't like hiking in spring? We were hiking in North Georgia, a state park I won't name so you don't go looking for it. It's beautiful out there. There's a river running through the gorge, places to swim and picnic, rock walls to climb if you're feeling bold, a lot of nature to commune with. We had just come to the end of the usual trail, the river continuing on, even if the marked trail didn't, and Jake looked at me oddly when I didn't turn around and go back. "I want to see what's up ahead," I told him. I had never been beyond that, but I'd always wanted to. "No way," he said. "That's out of bounds. The sign says there are holes or unstable terrain or something." So? "So it means it's dangerous. I know you're all about exploring, Chuck, but I'm not going to die today." "Oh, come on. It's just a little further. Don't be a wimp." He looked like he wanted to go back, but my heckling had gotten the better of him. Just a little. Okay, but if it looks bad, we turn around. Understand?" Yeah, I said, waving him off as I went past the sign and onto the unmarked trail. The signs were needless anyway, I thought. Georgia's swampy in some places, and sinkholes and subterranean caves aren't that uncommon. We'd just avoid the soft areas, and we'd be fine. I'd read online that there was a waterfall at the end of the trail, but I'd never seen it. Some hikers said that it was beautiful, that it went all the way back up the cliff, which would be a pretty long drop for a waterfall. I wanted some pictures for my travel blog, and as we walked down the trail, I just knew this was going to be a hike we'd both remember for years to come. I must not have been watching where I was going, because all the warning I got was a little cracking sound before I was suddenly in free fall. I was watching the hole in the ground get smaller and smaller as I fell, and then everything went black for a little while. When I opened my eyes, that circle of light above me was like a spotlight. I groaned as I tested my limbs, my back, my neck, and found myself mostly in good shape. My head hurt, but my arms and legs still worked. I'd fallen onto some moss or something that had probably saved my life, if not my brains, from splattering all over the floor. And as I lay there staring up at the ceiling, I saw a silhouette impose itself over some of the light. "Chuck! Thank God, I thought you were dead. I'm trying to get the Rangers, but I can't get a signal. You break anything?" I sat up a little, rubbing my head where a knot was forming. I felt a twinge of pain in my back, but nothing too bad. I was smart enough not to push it, though, lest I mess myself up further and unrepairably. "I don't know. My back, I think." "Well, that's better than most people if they fall into an underground cave, I guess. Unfortunately, I've got all the climbing hooks and you've got all the rope. I'm going to head back up to the swimming hole and see if I can get some help. Hang tight. I'll be right back." Before I could say anything, Jake was gone, and I was left with nothing but the moss and the darkness around me. I didn't know how big the cave was, and if it was a cave at all, but the blackness just seemed deep and impenetrable. As I lay there, the pain beginning to seep into my body, I thought I heard something. It was light, no more than a tickle on my senses, but it was definitely something. It was like something with claws, walking quietly on stone, like a rat, but bigger than usual. I thought it was my imagination at first, but as it circled my spot like a shark preparing to strike, I realized I wasn't imagining it. I lay as still as I could, hoping that whatever it was would decide I wasn't interesting or edible. But when it spoke, I was taken off guard. It sounded like a woman, like a young, pretty woman. "Hello?" I stayed quiet, not sure what was going on, hoping it was a delusion or a hallucination. "Is someone there?" It sounded real, though, not like any of the voices I had ever heard in a daydream or a regular dream, and despite myself, I decided to answer. "Hello?" There was silence for several long breaths. Then it spoke again. "Are you from up there?" she asked, and I assumed she was pointing at the ceiling. "Yeah, my name's Charles. What's yours?" Silence. Silence. Then it spoke again. "I don't have one. No one has ever called me anything." That was weird. I didn't know anyone who didn't have a name. made me wonder how long she'd been down here and who had left her down here. Had she fallen into one of these subterranean tunnels like I had? Had she gotten trapped without any way out? I asked her, but after 2 long breaths, she told me that she didn't know. I don't remember ever not being down here. It's my home. If I lived up there, it was a very long time ago. The long pause between conversations was a little weird, but I put it out of my mind. Clearly, she didn't get a lot of chances to talk to people, and she was just remembering how to make conversation. There was nothing wrong with that. In fact, I was glad she'd found me. I didn't want to be down here all by myself, and maybe I could help her out once Jake came back. "Why don't you come over here into the light?" I asked, patting the stone beside my moss bed. "That way I can see you." Silence. Silence. Then, "I don't really like the light. It hurts my eyes and it burns my skin." That made sense, I thought. If she had been down here long enough, then she was probably kind of sensitive to light. I remembered reading about people who lived in the dark too long and go blind when you take them into the sun, and I felt foolish for asking. It was really more my sense of vanity anyway. The idea that I might be talking to some old hag had crossed my mind, but she sounded young and pretty, and I guess I just wanted to look. "Is there anyone down here with you?" I asked, hearing my throat click as I said it. My throat was dry, and when I reached behind me, I felt for my water bottle and realized it had rolled off in the fall. I was thirsty. I didn't know how long Jake would be gone. "Hey, you don't see a clear water bottle anywhere in here, do you? There's water in it, and I'm so thirsty." Sitting in the sunbeam wasn't helping matters much, and I was scared to move or go looking for my sunscreen. I wasn't in a lot of pain, but they said that a neck or a back injury could be exacerbated if you moved. I lay there, frying like a fish, and I just knew I was going to have a wicked sunburn when I finally got out of here. When the water bottle rolled out of the darkness and bumped my hand, I had to stop myself from flinching away from it. I reached down, trying to move as little as possible, and as the water hit my throat, it was like pure honey. I splashed a little on my face, imagining I could hear the sizzle, and sighed in relief as I found some comfort from the heat. "Thank you," I said, looking at the darkness as if expecting to see someone peeking at me. Silence. Silence. Then, "No problem. You're the first person I've had to talk to in a long time. I don't want you to lose your voice." I smiled, glad to give her the comfort of a human voice. We talked a little, mostly involving me talking and her adding in little things every now and again. I told her about hiking and Jake, about the world above, and she seemed to enjoy my descriptions of things like TV and movies. For her part, she told me that she had lived in the tunnels down here for a while, and that she could see in the dark pretty well. She ate whatever she found in the tunnels, and I wasn't the first person to fall down here. That made me feel bad for her. "None of them offered to get you out?" "You are the first person to be alive when you fell in. Some of them are alive for a little while, but they don't stay alive for long. No one comes for them, and they succumb to the fall." That gave me a chill. "You mean they die?" Silence. Silence. Then, "They do not find their bodies. I told you, Charles. I eat what I find in the cave." My mouth was going dry again, but it had nothing to do with the heat. She just admitted to being a cannibal, but I suppose one couldn't hold that against her either. She was trapped down here. Food was probably not plentiful. She had to survive the best she could, but I couldn't understand how the Park Service didn't know people were going missing. How did they not collect the bodies before she got a chance to eat them? Did they just think people got lost in the park? I thought that maybe they should be a little more proactive, but then Jake's voice whispered in my head, like putting up a sign to stay off the dangerous trail. "Were you," I tried to ask, my tongue getting stuck to the roof of my mouth,
Were you planning to eat me? Silence. Silence. Then, yes, she said, not showing the slightest bit of hesitation. But you were alive and the sun was up. I usually don't find the bodies till after dark, so there's no sun to keep me away. That made me shudder. It isn't often you get to have a conversation with someone who's planning to have you for dinner. And if the sun had been down and I was still alive, I started, but I couldn't finish the thought. I didn't have to, though. Silence. Silence. And then, yes, she said. I was quiet, not sure how to answer, but she beat me to it again. I have to eat, Charles. All creatures must eat, and I am no exception. You don't feel weird about eating your own kind? I asked, trying to find the right words so she wouldn't be offended. Silence. Silence. Then, I don't eat my own kind, Charles. I eat people. My teeth chattered a little at that. Translation, she wasn't a person, which led my mind to ask the question I didn't dare voice. What was she? What was I down here with? Even if my back wasn't injured, even if I wasn't paralyzed, something I was pretty sure I wasn't, I still had no way to get out. I could no more jump 30 feet than I could have tossed Jake the rope, and I was at her mercy, it seemed. She needn't wait until dusk, I thought, as I watched a cloud cruise across the mouth of the hole. If it started to rain, if it became overcast, even if some stray cloud covered my hole in shadows, it would be nothing for her to snatch me back into the darkness. It was a sobering realization to discover that my life was hanging so tenuously. Charles? She asked, and I heard that clicking noise getting closer. Charles, are you okay? I hadn't noticed until now, but her voice sounded artificial. It was like something approximating the sound of a voice. A speaker playing someone's voice from a video or something. It was a good copy, but I wanted to know what was making it. The longer I lay here, the less certain I was that she was a girl. The more certain I was talking to a monster. Charles, she said, and there was worry in her voice, as well as hunger. I'm here, darling, I said, making myself answer her. I was just wool gathering. I hit my head when I came down, and it made me feel a little woozy. The clicking came even closer to the circle of light, a circle that was suddenly not nearly wide enough. I do not know this word, woozy. What does it mean? Is it like being tired? Yeah, I said. Yeah, it's a lot like being tired. I kept looking up, hoping to see Jake and the Rangers up there. How long had it been? It had to have been at least half an hour. I couldn't imagine that no help had come in half an hour. Even if he had to walk all the way back to the station at the trailhead, someone should have come along by now. I didn't know if they could stop her from dragging me off and eating me, but I really hoped so. Charles? Yeah, I said, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I thought it did. Are you afraid? I had to stop myself from answering with a big old Texas-sized hell yes, since that might provoke her. Nah, darling. Why would I be scared? The clicking came up to the edge of the light, slow and unsure, and I imagined that I could see something there, just beyond the shadows. A face or something. It did not look at all human. It looked like a bad driftwood carving of a strange idol from a heathen tribe outside of civilization, and I found it hard not to stare at the spot. Your heart is beating very fast. Your blood is pumping through your veins like a river. I can hear it. It's making me hungry. Are you afraid of me?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but that was when someone called my name, and a shadow imposed itself across the light. It felt like too much, and I wanted them to move away as they blotted out some of the light. "Chuck!" Jake yelled. "Are you okay?" "Sure, great," I lied, glancing over to see the face I hadn't seen was gone. Someone else cast a shadow over me, and I was shaking as my light was cut off by half. "Chuck, my name's Ranger Mike, and I'm here to help. Ranger Gabe and I are going to rappel down. Is your back or neck injured?" I don't think so," I yelled, listening for the clicking and the voice of the not woman. I think I just hit my head." Mike talked to someone up there, and they concurred. "We're going to drop down flares so we don't get stuck. Close your eyes, okay?" I nodded, but there was no way in hell I was going to close my eyes with that thing around. It was strange how quickly she had become it, and how little I wanted to bring her back up with me now. I had no idea what I'd been talking to, and suddenly I didn't want to know. I wanted out of this hole, out of this hell, and I promised whatever was listening that I would never scoff at signs there to keep me safe again. If they would get me out of here, I might never even come back to the woods again. The flares came down, and I saw the cave was much bigger than I had thought it was. The flares sent up ghostly light, casting everything in flickering illumination, and that was when I saw it. It was only for a second, as it retreated down a side passage, but I caught a glimpse of what I'd been talking to. The driftwood carving analogy wasn't far off, the whole thing looking white and thin and kind of fragile looking. It walked around on these long, thin legs that looked like nothing so much as pure bone, and its eyes were high up in its bony forehead. It looked at me almost apologetically as it left, but the two rangers who rappelled down never so much as glanced into the cave. They had me up on a stretcher before I could warn them, and after securing it to the ropes, they had all three of us winched up as the flares burned in the darkness below. There were more rangers at the top, paramedics too, and they got me up topside, and I was dragged to stable ground as I was checked out by the EMTs. They said the bruise on my head was nasty, but there probably wasn't any brain damage. My spine appeared fine, though they wouldn't know for sure until I had an EKG, and my neck felt okay too. Ultimately, they said I was very lucky, and I told them they didn't know the half of it. I'm in a hospital room now, waiting for my EKG, but just wanted to get this down while it was fresh. I can't prove that it wasn't a hallucination. The ER doc said I was definitely concussed, but I think it was real. I talked with something under the ground, something that would have eaten me if it hadn't been for the light encircling me. I was extremely lucky in a lot of ways, and I thank God that I made it out with little more than cuts and bruises. If I hike again, I'll be paying more attention to the signs from now on. You never know what you might find just below the surface. Such a good story. Makes me look forward to camping again, getting back out in nature, as soon as this last cold spurt puts itself to bed for another season. But, speaking of time in the woods, let's hear a little story about some less than enjoyable time spent in nature. Let's hear about why I left the woods.
"Yeah, it's just me here tonight," I said as I washed up a few dishes. The darkness outside seemed held at bay by the big floodlight on the pole. The forest surrounding our little cabin looked like a green wave that was preparing to swallow our circle of humanity up forever, and it was only thanks to that 120-watt bulb that we were saved. I had the phone pressed against my ear, and I laughed as my boyfriend said something funny. The phone slipped towards the soapy water, and I caught it just in time as something scratched at the door again. "What?" "Nah, they haven't come home yet." Uncle Ricky doesn't usually like to be out in the woods after dark. I opened the back door as another loud scratch came from it, and Benji walked in. The mutt had been with our family for years, and as he lumbered in, he wagged his tail and gave me a big doggy grin. I wrinkled my nose with disgust when I noticed that he'd been rolling in something. There was red-brown crust all over his right side, and at first I mistook it for blood. When I saw he wasn't limping, though, I figured it was just mud, or worse, blood off of some carcass he'd rolled around in the woods. I started after him as he made his way towards the laundry room where his food bowls were, my boyfriend prattling away in my ear. "Rick, I'm going to have to call you back," I said, making my way towards the laundry room before Benji could roll around on the clean laundry. "Everything okay, babe?" "Yeah, but Benji rolled in something, and I don't want him to get it all over the house." "Okay, well, stay safe. Love you. Love you too, Rick. See you tomorrow." I hung up the phone and took a step towards the laundry room. I had just reached for the bristle brush by the sink when my phone blared from the countertop. I turned away from Benji and walked towards the phone, checking the caller ID to see who it was. Brad's smiling face was plastered across the screen, and I picked it up on the third ring. I figured it would be them telling me they were on their way and running late. I didn't get 3 words out, however, before I was immediately buffeted by a wall of static and Brad's frantic voice yelling as he cut in and out. I held the phone a little away from my ear, like it might explode. "Hello? Oh, God, thank God, Rach. I need you to call the sheriff right now." His tone was equal parts terror and fury, and I was immediately worried. "What happened? Is everything okay?" "Uncle Ricky's hurt pretty bad, and Dad's not in the best shape either. Dad says to call the sheriff and get an ambulance. Lock the door until we get there." "Brad, what happened? Do it, Rachel. We'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone until we get there." Then he hung up on me, and I was left looking at the silent brick. I tried the sheriff's office, but the phone just rang and rang before connecting me with static. The phone number for the ambulance did the same, and by this point, I was starting to get scared. Was there a problem with the phones in town? Had some disaster happened out in the woods that spilled over into town? As I went to lock the door, I saw the familiar headlights of Dad's old pickup coming up the driveway. I flung it open instead and went to help them. Dad came out of the back, hoisting Uncle Ricky under the arm, and Brad hopped out of the driver's seat and ran over to help him. Uncle Ricky hung limply between them, and I could see at a glance that he was not in good shape. His flannel shirt and jeans were covered in blood, and though it was hard to tell, I thought his left arm might be gone. Dad was covered in blood too, but it looked like some of it might be Uncle Rick's. He had 4 long claw marks running through his left eye, and it was swelling too badly for me to tell if the eye still worked. Brad shouted at me to get the door, and I complied as all 3 of them came running into the living room. In the light, it was easy to tell how bad Uncle Rick was. His arm was gone. The sleeve had been used to make a tourniquet around the stump, and his breathing was shallow as he lay on the couch in a state of unconsciousness. Brad said something about getting back for the guns, but Dad shut him down and sent us both to lock the doors. After the house was secure, Dad asked me if I'd called the sheriff or the ambulance. I told him about the strange static, and he swore loudly as he took his own cell phone out of his pocket. He dialed a number, and I could tell by his face that he was getting the same result. Finally, he swore and threw the phone against the wall. "I guess we're on our own," he said, and it was the most hopeless sound I'd ever heard come out of my daddy. Even when Mama died, he'd still kept a strong face on for us. "What's going on? What happened to Uncle Rick?" I asked. Dad looked over at Brad, and after a silent conference, Dad started to tell it. "We'd been hunting for most of the day. We hadn't caught a damn thing. Something was scaring the game off. We heard it walking around a few times and thought it was a bear. Your Uncle Rick said it smelled like a bear. So when the sun started going down, we decided it was time to pack it in. We started getting everything together. Right out of the blue, a doe steps out in the meadow. She looked around real skittish-like and starts cropping grass real quick. She clearly smelled whatever had been making that noise all day, but the deer has to eat, and she started filling her belly as quickly as she could. Your uncle sighted her up and dropped her real easy, and we figured at least we'd have one thing to show for our efforts. No sooner did we get to the edge of the meadow when a big old something comes crashing out. It grabbed our deer and bolted back into the woods like a bat out of hell. It kind of looked like a bear, I guess, The sun was setting, and it was hard to tell, but it moved quicker than any bear I'd ever seen. Brad and I were just going to let it go, but Rick was mad as I'd ever seen him. He tore off after it, saying he was going to take that thing home instead. So we follow him, not wanting to leave him in the woods alone after dark, and we chased this thing into its cave. At that point, I was sure it was a bear, so we go creeping in, trying to surprise it. As the sun sets behind us, we see this thing hunkered over the deer, and it weren't no bear. It's wolfing at the deer, just slurping down big mouthfuls, and Rick gets real pale and starts gibbering about how it's the thing that we saw when we were kids. Wait, I interrupted, you've seen this thing before? Dad looked perturbed, but nodded. Yeah, that's why Rick hated to go into the woods after dark. When we were teenagers, we were up in a stand hunting deer. Rick sights one before sunset, and he drops it, much like we had tonight. We're about to go get it when this big thing comes out of the woods and starts wolfing it down right there in the meadow. Well, you know your Uncle Rick. He always had a temper. So he pops off a shot at it. Hits it too, but that don't do nothing but piss it off. It comes roaring and charging up to the bottom of our tree and starts clawing and pushing until it topples it over. We jump out just as it hits the ground and just go tearing off running for the truck. And that was what you saw today? Well, Dad hedged, it was almost dark when we shot the deer, and we never got a good look at it. All I know is that's what chased us out of the woods, and Rick wouldn't go hunting with us for the next 3 years after that. He paused for a minute to make sure I was out of questions before continuing his story. So with Rick gibbering, this thing looks up and sees us. I swear to you that it came up on its hind legs and walked like a man as it ran at us. Rick pops a shot off, probably just panic fire, but it just shrugs it off and lands on him. I saw his arm, rifle and all, go into its mouth, and I heard it crunch as it bit it clean off. Rick starts screaming, and we all start yelling. Before it can finish him off, though, Brad and I pepper it 4 or 5 times with buckshot. It must have dazed it, because it rolled off of Rick with a loud shriek and stumbled back towards the cave. It sounded like a man screaming, Brad said, and Dad nodded before going on. It starts flailing around in pain, and we grabbed Rick and start dragging him back towards the truck. This thing came after us, and it sounded like it was crashing through the trees the whole way. We couldn't move very fast. Each of us had an arm under Rick as we drug him along, and I swear it would have had us if it hadn't been for Benji. My blood suddenly ran cold. Benji? Yeah, poor little guy. He's been with us the whole time. He didn't seem to want anything to do with that thing, but when it jumped on us again and raked my face, he started growling and lunges right at it. I hear them tearing and snarling at each other, and we just hightailed it back to the truck. It's a wonder we ever found it in the dark. Poor old Benji. He sacrificed himself so we could get away. Both Brad and my dad looked forlorn, but I just shook my head. No, he didn't. He's right here. Dad gave me a funny look. What are you talking about? He came wandering in not long before you guys did. That's when I remembered the blood on his fur. There was no way he could outrun the truck. Hell, the only reason I hadn't questioned it was because I had forgotten he had gone with him. I looked back towards the kitchen door, and it creaked open as Benji's friendly grin poked through the gap. He strolled into the living room, his fur still a mess of blood and mud, and glanced around the room as his tail wagged and his big old doggy smile stretched across his face. When he stepped up on his hind legs, I thought for sure I was dreaming. Benji leapt across the living room, and when he hit the couch, he was no longer the cuddly mutt we'd all come to love. He was 200 pounds of sleek black fur and raking claws that reduced my family to a spray of blood and screams of mercy. I fell back from the scene, covering my eyes with my hands to block it all out. I could still hear every bone-wrenching yank, every blood-splattering swipe, and every watery gurgle as my family had their throats torn out. I was numb. My mind shrank away from the scene before me as I backpedaled until my back hit the wall of the cabin. I curled my knees up to my chest and put my head against my knees as I sank to the floor and waited for it to be over. I didn't care at that moment whether I lived or died. I only wanted it to end. I could feel myself crying as the living room became a killing field. And when it finally ended, I could hear the overpowering bray of my explosive sobs. My sobs stopped when I heard heavy footsteps walking towards me. I didn't look up. I didn't want to look up. But when the creature's hot breath puffed against the top of my head, I pulled my face away from my knees despite myself. His blood-smeared face was inches from mine, and I quickly buried my face against my knees again. It was leaning over me, my family's blood pattering onto my skin, and it was all I could do not to pass out from terror. We stayed like that for several minutes, until I couldn't take it anymore. I lifted my head and looked at this semi-feline face and asked the question, Why haven't you killed me yet? His voice was high, like a bee that's been caught in a jar, and it hurt my ears to listen to him. Because you helped me. For that favor, I will give you a favor in return. Leave my woods before sunset tomorrow, and I will allow you to continue to exist. Stay, and you will share the fate of your kin. Then he turned and walked out of the house on 2 legs. I was gone before the sun came up. I threw my clothes in a bag, took the pickup my brother had been careless enough to leave the keys in, and drove. My phone rang a few times, but I ignored it. The hardest was when Aunt Clara called, but after 3 days, even she stopped calling. They likely assumed I was dead too. I sold the truck before I left the state and haven't looked back. I drove until I couldn't see the forest anymore. I drove until I couldn't see 3 trees grouped close enough to obscure anything. And when the desert stretched out before me, I finally stopped. I'll make my life here now. I have no intention of ever leaving the desert again. I don't know what forest this creature calls its own, and I never want to find out.
We're past the midway point now, but don't worry. There's plenty more wonderful stories to come, like this one, about a writer who fears he may have gone a bit too far, and it may have ultimately ruined him. So, turn your volumes up, and let's listen close for the whispers.
I am a murderer. I'm responsible for the deaths of 75 within 2 weeks. I've stabbed men to death, rendered bodies to ash, killed children in the womb, and even drowned whole ships at sea. I've changed the fate of kingdoms and seen to it that uncharted planets remained unfound. I would likely be the most prolific serial killer in the United States, if not for one problem. The police claim that if murdering fictional characters was a crime, they'd have to jail Stephen King and George R. for multiple life sentences. They say this as they laugh me out of the police station. They think it's a joke, or that maybe I'm not right in my head. But I can assure you, I'm as right as I've ever been. I listened to them tell their stories for years, and I've heard them scream when I end their lives. I'm a murderer, pure and simple, and their blood is on my hands. You're probably reading this, though, and thinking that I'm ready for the rubber room. Let me start from the beginning. I've always been a creative mind. When I was younger, I could hear them whisper to me about their homes, their verdant green kingdoms, their sterile, majestic spaceships, the feel of rolling decks beneath their feet, and so much more. It manifested in my games, and my school friends would always gather around to see what today's adventure would be. We traveled the cosmos, fought wars between elves and men, and roamed imaginary prairies as we hunted wrongdoers on horseback. As I grew older, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and their stories became my stories. I wrote about the kingdoms of my youth, the adventures of my childhood, and by the time I was 20, I had 5 books published, even one on the New York Times bestseller list. As I grew, so grew my fame. My writing was prolific, and all the while the voices told me their stories. I took my readers to fantastic places, and their patronage allowed me to live quite well. By the time I was 30, I had a home and a family and enough published work to fill a bookshelf. That's when the problems started. It all started with Aberdeen Price, dashing archaeologist adventure. He told me of his next adventure, a trip to the city of Bone. However, I was working on something else at the time, and didn't want to divert efforts away from my current project. So I wrote some notes and promised myself I would sit down and give him some time when I was done. This apparently wasn't good enough for Aberdeen. He came every night in my dreams and told me his story over and over and over again, until finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I stopped what I was doing and diverted all my attention to writing his next book. It was a hit, a bestseller, and the biggest mistake of my life. You see, this showed the voices that they could get what they wanted by badgering me. Every night from that night on, they would come to me and tell me their stories, each overlapping the other, until I just couldn't take it anymore. The kingdom of Verdant Green was once at the mercy of the dark wizard Zormuth. His evil armies threatened to... Scanners once more alert Kevin Gorel that he is nearing his destination. The dark planet Zephyr rises from the darkness of space as he see the island of Katmandil off the starboard side of Elizabeth's Folly. The shore is quiet, but Captain Cree can once again see the natives amongst the trees as he hears his quarry. The elusive Dr. Burton will strike again this night, and I will be ready to... Their voices towered in my mind, like the screams of children as they tried to make themselves heard. That was my first mental breakdown, and my worst. My wife arrived home in time to save me from bleeding to death. They put me in an institution for 3 weeks after that. Lisa thought it was all the strain of my busy writing schedule. The strain of writing so much must have just become too much for you, she said, as she stood by my bedside and looked down with pity for her poor, brilliant husband. She had no idea. The worst part wasn't the IVs or the sedatives, the shitty TV, or the staying in a room for 24 hours a day, the sounds of sorrow from down the hall, even the constant itching from the healing cuts on my arms. It was the week and a half I spent with my hands in restraints. Without my hands, I couldn't write. Without writing, there was no way to stop the shrieking harpies in my brain from driving me insane. It took me a while to convince them that writing was a kind of therapy for me. The battle was made all the harder by my wife's constant arguments about how the writing had put me here in the first place. After a week and a half of no change, they had begun to see that I might be making some sense. I began to write again, and the changes were noticeable. I started sleeping, became less hostile, finished my meals, and a month later I was ready to go home. The voices started ramping up again almost immediately. By this point in my career, I had 7 stories running on and off. That's a lot of voices trying to be heard. I tried to keep up with them, but I could feel my sanity slipping again as they screamed for my attention day and night. By my 2nd week home, my wife was ready to have me committed all over again. I'd stop sleeping and would lock myself in my study for days to make the voices stop for even a few minutes. That was when my first murder took place. That's not to say that no one had ever died in my stories. Characters die in stories. That's the nature of storytelling. But this was the first time I'd ever deviated from the path set forward by the voices. Detective Sam Umbridge was coming to the climactic end of his latest crime novel, and the shootout with the killer was becoming heated. I had meant to write that Dario West, the antagonist of the novel, was struck by Sam's bullet as he leaned around the doorframe. Before I knew what I'd done, though, I had written the death of beloved gumshoe Sam Umbridge instead. I had moved on to the next sentence before I caught my error, but it was too late by then. He died in my head with a gut-wrenching scream, and just like that, his voice was mercifully silent. For a moment, all the voices were silent. It was as though they had all seen what I had done in my manic state. I cleaned up the draft a little bit before sending it off. Sam and Dario had killed each other in the shootout, and Sam had died victorious. Fans hated that Detective Sam Umbridge would never make another appearance on their shelves, but they accepted it. The end was widely praised by fans and critics alike, an all-around success. My agent even called to congratulate me on the climax of a much-beloved series, and asked if everything was going all right with me. Last time we talked, you sounded as though you were a little shell-shocked. I guess I wasn't shocked now that I think of it. The process really made me think. Why not kill what was driving me crazy? I didn't have to kill them all,
just enough of them to make the voices quiet down a little. Like any prolific serial killer will tell you, it's hard to stop once you've started. Before I quite realized what I'd done, I'd ended them all. I ended my 8-book fantasy series with the death of the entire court and the eventual fall of the protagonist in his order. I watched as Kelvin Gorel flew his ship and crew into the phantom night, where certain doom awaited, and he would never be heard from again. After sinking the ship of his arch-rival, I had the Spanish Armada sink Elizabeth's Folly with all hands aboard, while Captain Cree floated atop the waves after taking a sword to the belly. I dropped a tomb on the head of Aberdeen Price, the one who had started my descent, and made the ruins he was exploring his own tomb in turn. I killed them all, one by one, and the fans were livid. How could you just kill them? Why wouldn't you simply end the series on a high note? Why did they all have to die? I toyed with the idea of ending their series, but I knew that it wouldn't work the moment I thought of it. They were never my stories in the end. They were only my stories to tell. If I left them alive, they would always want one more adventure. Killing them was all I could do to stop my descent into madness. And as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt myself smile at the thought of my long-awaited sleep. It never came. I've been staring at my sleeping wife for the past 7 hours as I keep court with the whispering dead. Their spirits are unwilling to die. The part of my soul I put inside them, reluctant to be put to rest. It's only now that I see the folly of my actions. The dead, you see, are not to be satiated with adventures or the continuing joy of existence. They moan, they wail, they bemoan the lives and the loves that were taken from them. At first, it was only for me that I wept. Now I see that this curse won't end with me. You see, I was watching my daughter as she played in the park yesterday. She played in the sandbox, her dolls and her brother's action figures out on an adventure of her own creation. I watched her going about her games of make-believe as I sat in a daze. When I asked her about it over lunch, she told me a story about knights and castles, people hunting for dragons, and brave warriors protecting those in need from harm. It was a story just like the ones I had made up as a kid. The kingdom was similar to the one I had left in ashes. I beg you, anyone out there who hears the whispers, don't pass the gift to others. It must end with us, and never darken the mind again. I must keep my own vigil now. I must watch my own daughter now, before the madness takes hold. I can't let the whispers have her too, even if it means the death of another of my creations. I won't let the madness have her.
One last story. Then I think it might be time for me to get a little shut-eye. But don't worry, I saved one of my favorites for last. When it's your time to go, how do you want to be buried? Would you want to be in a graveyard for the rest of your life? Have your ashes scattered somewhere? Me personally, I think I might like the piece that we find in the next story, where you use your remains to fuel the life of a tree, and maybe, just maybe, you share your essence with that noble tree forever. So, let's take a trip to Whispering Pines Memorial Forest. It is my pleasure to unveil an innovation in burial services. The investors looked uncomfortable as they sat in the hot sun on the edge of John's latest investment. When the tech mogul had bought 500 acres of swampland, people had speculated that he meant to build another factory for his microchips. Tech magazines had floated the idea of everything from warehouses to a new robotics division and everything in between, but none of them could have guessed his true intentions. His stock price had doubled since the announcement, and investors seemed to be holding their breath to see what would come out of Yomite Solutions this season. Only his accountant had known the real story, and he had been sworn to secrecy. Not a word to anyone, John said, winking as his usual smile spread across his face. Wayne had snorted. John, no one would believe me if I told them. Now here they were, their eyebrows raised as he talked about Not some new piece of tech, but an innovation in the burial of all things. Behind me stands 500 acres of new growth, trees ready to provide mankind with oxygen, and many helpful species of insects and wildlife will find a place to live here. Beneath them, however, are the first in a long line of subjects in our land renewal innovation. The bodies are infused with seeds. The seeds take root and use them for nourishment, and, as such, become a sort of casket for the dead. He saw some of the squirming looks held by those gathered, and decided to squash them. Behind me stands what will one day be a new forest, a forest that will be untouchable thanks to the laws now in place. Think of it, every cemetery a forest, every boneyard a park, every place of death a place of rebirth. This is the future, a future that bodes well for the earth and for the health of our planet. Welcome to Yomite Pines Memorial Forest, a place of eternal rest and peace. The investors clapped. It wasn't over-enthusiastic, but they clapped. They would see, in time, that it was a good middle ground. John had done a lot of harm to this planet with his factories, his smog, and his landfills full of obsolete electronics. If he could turn people's minds and grow a memorial forest in every state, it would go a long way towards making him feel better about the business and his soul. John Yomite, in fact, hoped to be buried in one of these forests himself one day. He had no way of knowing how soon that dream might become a reality. That was the first night that he had the dream. He was running through the rows of newly planted pines, the ground groaning as they grew towards the heavens. They towered over him, their branches grasping for the sky, and as they blotted out the moon, he heard their whispers. Join us, join us, join us in the soil. The ground sucked at his feet as he ran. The sand clung to him as if trying to hold him down, and as he jogged through the park that he had created, a cold wind blew amongst the trees. He woke up in his bed as the whispers grew, and breathed a sigh of relief when he realized it had all been a dream. Did the water in his morning shower look a little darker as it went down the drain? Were there leaves in the pocket of his sleeping shorts? Was there maybe even some mud he overlooked on his arms and legs? Maybe, but if there were, John didn't see them. He shook it off his nerves as he got ready for the day, but it wouldn't be the last time he ran through the trees by night. Wow, John, if you'd told me this thing would take off like this a year ago, I would have called you crazy. John looked down over the forest of pines and oaks, their tops coming in as they grew strong. The glass window over his tower made the perfect observation platform, and the glass was thick enough to block out the whispers he sometimes heard when he walked the grounds. Wayne was going over the numbers, but John was barely listening. You did call me crazy, John said, looking down over his forest of trees. He had built this tower so he could watch the forest grow, and he found he was truly at peace when he stood up here. Watching them sway, watching them grow, it was all so different from anything he had done before. Did I? Wayne said. I guess I was wrong. This has been a bigger windfall than any of your previous endeavors. John would have agreed if it hadn't been for the incidences that kept cropping up. Who would have thought that people would pay so much to save the planet and to be one with the burgeoning forest? John asked. Now, if we could just figure out why people keep going missing, we'd be set, Wayne retorted. He said it with a laugh, but John really didn't find it funny. If it had been one or two, John could have understood, but what kind of memorial garden loses double-digit guests in their first year? The large forest had become a popular tourist spot, and people had come to camp and walk and take in the natural beauty of the new-growth forest.
The trees were only about half the size that they would grow to be, but they were still an impressive stature. They were the living embodiment of those who had nourished them. At least that's what the papers and some of the journals were saying. There were plans to grow more of them if participation was good, and so far it had been. People were interested in helping the environment, and having a quiet and beautiful place for their relatives to visit them. And the list of people who had bought places in Yomite Pines would facilitate the buying of another 20 or 30 acres at least. It had all been looking so promising before people started going missing. At first, it wasn't anything to get excited about. A couple of campers never arrived back home. An older couple that never returned to their car after a visit. A man who never walked back out the front gate after walking in. These things were odd, but not unexplainable. People did all kinds of silly things, and this was no more than someone who simply decided to leave by another way, or had forgotten to check out, or perhaps decided to lose themselves on purpose and find a quiet place to die. The kid, however, was something else. Marcus Lorraine was 6 and had accompanied his parents into the little forest so he could visit his grandmother. They had walked amongst the trees, taken in the paths and little bridges and the shallow river that ran through it, but when they had turned to go, Miss Lorraine had noticed that her son was nowhere to be found. She swore he had been with them when they crossed the little bridge over the river. She swore he had been with them when they stopped to dip their toes into the water. She swore he had been with them when they stopped at the bathrooms. She also swore that she couldn't be certain after they had passed the picnic area and started heading back to their car. I don't remember much after the picnic area, if I'm being honest, she said, her dreamy voice at odds with her tearful demeanor of a moment before. I'd been walking along, listening to something, and for a moment it was almost like I was hearing my mom talk to me. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you that I could almost hear her voice. Her husband had said something similar, though not quite the same. He could swear he heard people whispering just out of sight, like they were sitting in the woods and discussing important matters. He described it like the scene in The Hobbit, where the dwarves keep interrupting the elves' party. He could hear them, but he knew that if he went to investigate, they would all just melt away and reappear somewhere else. Regardless, neither of them could say when little Marcus had left their side, but he was gone now, and they wanted him found. John stayed with the parents while the forest was searched. He had set up a little command center near the visitor center and was directing volunteers from there. Mr. Lorraine had gone out to help them at the start, but by sunset, he was back at the tent and sitting with his wife. The two were holding each other, both praying quietly as they waited for their son to return. They were upset, but John had yet to see them cry. They were afraid, but they didn't look overly fearful. He would have thought they'd be in shock, except that they kept looking into the forest as if someone were calling to them before going back to their prayers. This isn't good, John said under his breath. You don't say, Wayne had said, looking at the parents as he pitched his voice low. Be as glib as you want, but Marcus Lorraine's disappearance doesn't look good. Wayne pulled him aside out of earshot of the grieving parents so that they could talk. Do you have any idea how many kids go missing in the national park every year? Do you know how many theme parks lose kids without the help of creeps? Kids wander off, John. Probably find him asleep under a tree somewhere. They did not find him asleep under a tree somewhere. They didn't find him at all, as it happened. Marcus was the 15th person to go missing in the park that year, but he wasn't the last. We've had hundreds more pre-orders for the upcoming acreage. We'll sell the plots as quickly as they become available. It's almost like we're printing money. John was glad that Wayne had forgotten about the kid so easily, but John found it a little more difficult. He remembered each of the names, each a civil suit their families tried to file before his lawyers shut them down, and he supposed he probably always would. Wayne went on talking, but John couldn't take his eyes off the trees. Their sway was so hypnotic. Maybe this was why people kept going missing. That, or the whispering that he heard sometimes. He could even hear it a little up here, but it was always worse when he was on the grounds. It was like a slithering little voice that wormed its way into his ears, begging him to come and join the others who had already come to this place. And why not, he thought. They all seemed to have found peace here. Everyone seemed to find peace here. Maybe that was why so many of them came here too. "How's your mom?" Wayne asked suddenly, and the question jarred him back to reality. "Some days better, some days worse. She's fading, but she's going out slowly." "Will you plant her here too when the time comes?" Wayne asked, the question sounding uneasy. "I've saved her a spot from the very start," John said, looking at a place near the base of the tower. "I grew this forest for her, after all." Wayne excused himself after a little more small talk, but John stood there and watched the trees sway. Who wouldn't want to be laid to rest in such a peaceful place? It's an honor to stand here and ring in a year since the opening of Yomite Pines Memorial Forest. The crowd applauded excitedly, but as John stood looking out over them, all he could hear was the wind through the trees beyond them. They were all pines here at Yomite Pines, somehow or another. Mighty pines that grew lush and deep green in the hardy soil. In about a year, they had grown past the projections put forth at the start, and John now stood beneath towering trees that had been little more than half-grown saplings 2 years ago when he'd begun planting. He shuddered a little as something else rustled against his subconscious, but he put it aside, like he always did. It was just nerves, after all, just like the dreams. I'm proud to say we've incorporated another 100 acres, 50 of which has been donated by the North American Wildlife Foundation to help with the deforestation efforts. Of those new 100 acres, we have already filled 50 of them with fresh growth and new remains. The Yomite Pines Memorial Forest will soon be a forest stretching across the newly reclaimed land, and our world will be better for it. The applause from the crowd was much more enthusiastic than they had been last time. The thought of a forest of dead people had been a little sickening, a little spooky too, but now they were behind him. This reforestation project was a big hit, and people were signing up for plots in the hundreds. Though Yomite Pines might be a big hit with the people, John was beginning to have reservations about the project. It had been 6 months since Marcus had disappeared, and now his mother and father were also missing. John had once liked to stroll out here, just taking it all in and soaking in the peaceful landscape he had created. He had been on one such walk about 2 weeks after Marcus had gone missing, when he had seen Mrs. Lorraine walking down the path towards him. Walking might have been a stretch. Shelley Lorraine was wobbling like a drunk, and as she came towards him, she looked as if she were barely in the world. He called out to her, asking how she was doing and if there was any news on Marcus. But it took 3 such calls for her to look up and acknowledge him. "Huh?" she finally said, shaking her head as if she'd been sleepwalking. "Oh, Mr. Yomite, She seemed to mumble through what she was before answering. "As well as I can be, I suppose." "Did you come to look for Marcus?" he asked, wondering why she was here if she was still looking for her son. The whole park had been searched from border to border, but no sign of the kid had been found. It was as if the ground had simply swallowed him up and left nothing behind. They had moved on to the surrounding scrublands, but John was certain that he had seen the mother in the park more than once. The father had come in once as well, but that was the last time that John had seen him. He hadn't come back out again after that. and John supposed he was doing better than his wife. Here she was, high or drunk or both, and John would have to tell security to keep an eye on her. "Yes," she said, looking off into the trees as if someone had called her. "Yes, it's like I can hear him when I'm here. He keeps calling for me, and I keep hoping I'll find him. Excuse me," she said, and stepped into the tree line as she went off into the towering gravestones that surrounded them. That was the last time that John had seen her. The last time that anyone had seen her, actually. The whole family had disappeared, and Scott, the security guy over the park, actually showed him the security footage of Mr. Lorraine coming in but never leaving. He asked John what he wanted to do with it, and John had told him not to tell anybody about it. He must have left in a crowd, and we missed him. There's no reason to tell anyone about this. It was a tragedy, after all, but as guilty as John felt, he couldn't have something like this sabotaged by one family. This was his chance to make amends for some of the things he had done, to make amends to the one person whose opinion mattered to him. That was the last anyone spoke of the Lorraines, but it wasn't the last John thought of them. The new acreage will be open to the public next year, once the new growth has had time to get its roots. Until then, I invite all of you to enjoy Yeomite Park in its fullest. They applauded again, disappearing as John waved his way off stage. Wayne was waiting for him off stage too, all smiles. Maybe it was because he was an accountant, but as long as the money flowed, Wayne was happy. "Great speech," he said, walking beside John as the two made their way towards the tower. John watched as many of the people seated there took up walking through the park, looking in awe at the trees that had been grown from human compost. "We shouldn't be letting people just walk around the park anymore," John said suddenly. "It's too dangerous." Wayne looked confused, but as John finished, he grinned like a shot fox. "How else do you intend to pay for park services and expansion?" he said, smiling woodenly. Maybe it shouldn't be expanded. It shouldn't be open to the public either. No one picnics in a graveyard. No one goes bird-watching at the cemetery. The longer we let them walk the paths of Yeomite pines, the more of them will go missing. We're up to 20 this year, and it's probably more like twice that number. Something's happening here. You're too money-hungry to see it," John said, now real emotion in his voice. Wayne looked like he wanted to say something cutting, but he contented himself with a lame, says the billionaire tech mogul. John rounded on him. "This has nothing to do with money, nothing to do with fame or glory either. I've spent years killing this planet with my selfish ventures, and now it's time to give back. The planet deserves a chance to heal, and I intend to give it that. Yeomite Pines will sweep as far as I can push it, an untouchable beauty that will heal the world. There's no reason that people should be free to wander here." The door to his car was open, and he climbed in as he gave Wayne one final withering look. "I want to close the grounds by the start of next month. I don't care what it costs. Make it happen." Wayne watched him go, and he sighed as he watched him get smaller in the rearview mirror. John felt more at ease as he drove off. The incessant whispering was finally cut off, and that was good because it was getting to be more than he could take. Every time he came out to the pines, it got worse, but John still found himself drawn to the place. John dreamed about it most every night, and sometimes he woke up with dirty feet or muddy shoes at the foot of his bed. John didn't live too far from the park, but it was still 5 miles or more. Was he walking there in the middle of the night? Surely he wasn't driving, but what other option could there be? In his dreams, he walked amongst the trees, hearing the voices on the wind. In his dreams, he saw people walking amongst those trees, people who were as thin as fruit skins. They wanted him to join them, to come and be a part of them, and John found it harder and harder to ignore their call the longer it went on. He knew that one day he'd have to go to them, but until then, he still had work to do. This was a gift to his mother, after all, the woman who had been so disappointed with his actions, but had never stopped loving him. This was a final gift to her before she left the world forever. This was the last thing that he could do to make amends. The valet parked his car as he pulled up to the hospital, and as he rode the elevator up to the 7th floor, he wondered what state he would find her in today. She'd been getting weaker as the cancer ate at her, and it seemed unfair that it should be something like that that would take his mother from the world. She, who had marched against deforestation, who had gone to sit-ins for cleaner oceans and for endangered species, the woman who had loved the earth with all that she had, was going to be taken from it by something as mundane as cancer. His mother was going to be eaten alive by something that none of his money could do anything about, and John hated that more than anything. He came in to find her napping, but she opened her eyes as he took her hand and smiled at him. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked, trying not to cry, but knowing that his eyes were leaking. "Like I'm dying," she said, smiling despite herself. "Just not fast enough for the cancer's liking. We added another 100 acres to the park today. The ceremony was great. I wish you could have been there." "Me too," she said, her eyes drooping. She was so tired these days, so easily tapped out. "Mom, am I doing the right thing here? I know this is helping the environment, helping the world, but is it the right thing?" His mother smiled, her face sad but content. "I can't tell you that, dear. We all have to decide what's right and wrong for ourselves. I only want to do what would make you proud of me, what would make you proud to have me as a son." John was crying, really having a good boo-hoo, but he didn't care who saw it as he pressed his face against her shoulder. "Well," she said, laughing hoarsely, "then I'm glad my pain could be useful for something." He just sat there with her, the two of them enjoying the other's company. John had saved her a place for after she was gone, a place where she could be at peace within the earth. Her final good deed for the planet she loved so much. She would grow within the heart of the park, likely the largest tree in the park when she was done. She would rise above all the others, dwarfing all the pines as she rose for the sky. Till then, however, he would mourn her, one day at a time. He was running, the soil mashing between his toes as he went. The trees rose up around him, their voices high and beautiful. They called to him as he ran, asking why he was fleeing from them. They could bring him peace, too. They could make him complete within the soil. The moon was a ghostly sickle over top of him, and as he ran over the muddy ground of the park, his park, he felt more and more lost. He had built this place, had designed the layout, and it was unthinkable that he should be unable to find his way. This was a dream, anyway, he told himself. He was dreaming all this, no matter how much dirt he found on his sheets in the morning. These were all just nightmares, regardless of the filth he found at the bottom of his feet. Nothing here could hurt him, nothing could really get him, but that did little to hamper his fear as he ran. "Come to us, John. Come find peace in the soil." His spine prickled. Had that been Miss Lorraine? He took turns at random, his feet feeling heavy the further he went into the park as it sucked at him. The ground was hungry, and now it wanted him to go along with the others it had taken. He didn't understand how it could still be hungry, but it ate greedily as he sank more and more of them into the soil. Now it wanted him too, and as his feet came onto the sidewalk, he breathed a sigh of relief. The ground couldn't get him on the sidewalk. At least he didn't think so. He seemed to come back to himself as that thought came to him, and he realized this may not be a dream. Suddenly he was standing on the sidewalk, wearing his comfortable sleep pants and his sleeveless t-shirt, staring at the whispering sea of trees. He had found himself here before, wondering how he had gotten here, and as he reached for his phone, he realized it wasn't in his pocket. It wouldn't be, would it? It'd be on his nightstand, right where he'd left it. He looked at the tower and was thankful that he'd paid for night security. He started walking towards the edifice, preparing to answer some questions yet again. This is starting to become a problem, John. Wayne was pacing around his office in the tower as John sat drinking coffee in his night clothes. Scott had called Wayne for some reason, and John would have to have a word with him about that later. John signed the paychecks around here, not his accountant and VP of sales. Scott was likely worried that John was having a break from reality. John realized that didn't change matters, though. This was still John's project, and he was in charge. If the shareholders find out about this is going to be bad. John laughed. Shareholders? What shareholders? This project is being bankrolled by me and me alone. Wayne shook his head. I'm not talking about the park, John. I'm talking about the shareholders in your other companies. If they find out that you're wandering around your memorial garden every night, they might worry that you're losing it. John shrugged. Let them think what they want. This is more important than anything else. Wayne looked at him then like he might be crazy. Talk like that's going to bankrupt you. I know you're torn up about your mother, John, but this isn't the time to give up. John didn't say anything for a little while, staring at the coffee as it sloshed in his cup. I don't know if I want to add more acreage to this place. I don't know if I want people here or not. The only thing I do know is that this work is important to the planet, if not the people, and it needs to continue. Wayne left not long after that, and John was left to stare into his cup and wonder. Despite what he had told Wayne, he added another 100 acres to the park. Despite what he had told Wayne, the people still came to the park. They had a man-made lake now, 3 picnic areas, and enough parking for everyone buried here and then some. They also added nearly 30 missing patrons to the tally, putting them at around 60. There had been many searches of the grounds, but no one had ever been found. It had become quite a mystery, and as John drove into the park, he grimaced at the graffiti on the welcome sign. People kept spray painting "Whispering" over Yomite on the sign, and John had replaced it several times already. He'd have to get Scott to check the cameras again, though he found the name extremely appropriate. John's dreams had far from abated, and he rolled his window up as the whispering tried to find its way to him again. They beseeched him to come to them, to join them, and John didn't know how long he could resist them. The dreams were drawing him out here nightly, and he'd started waking up in the park more often than not. It was becoming more and more apparent that he was simply walking here at night, and there didn't seem to be any way to stop that from happening. Lately, however, the calls had been in a voice that he couldn't refuse. He walked into the park, sliding in his AirPods as he came through the gate, and the whispering intensified. It really was a beautiful place. The pines had come in nicely, and they were growing tall and healthy. They stretched out from the gate now, a mighty forest that had risen from nothing, and he was proud of his work. He was haunted by that work, too, but it didn't stop him from being proud of it. He had accomplished much in the 2 years since starting, but there was still so much work left to do. He stopped by one of the trees, the one near the base of the tower, and looked down at the new growth already poking its way through the soil. "Hey, Mom. Looking good," he whispered. She had passed about 3 months ago, not long after his conversation in her hospital room. She had been laid to rest in the park, his last gift to her, and the placard he had put up in front of her tree was the only real allocation for grave markers. Everyone else had a small number so their loved ones could find them, but his mother would only be important to him, and he knew that. She had been his last family, the only surviving piece, and now it was down to him to mourn her. When she had joined his dreams, adding her voice to the chorus, he didn't know how much longer he'd be able to hold out. Wayne was waiting for him when he got to the top of the tower, holding up the plans for the latest expansion. "We just got approval for another 100 acres. We should have it filled before June, and then the next 100 before this time next year, I guess. How much would it take to get another 1,000 acres? Wayne's eyes went a little wild. I mean, some of it would be available through government grants, but the cost would be steep. Make it happen. I don't care what it costs. Wayne looked at him oddly. You feeling okay? You're not planning on doing anything drastic, are you? He seemed to have noticed how close John was standing to the window. John couldn't exactly blame him for his concern. John had been feeling a little hinky, as his mom had been wont to say, and he wasn't sure what to do about it, or what he might do about it. I'll get the papers drawn up, Wayne said, rolling up the survey charts. I talked with Scott about the sign, too. As usual, they can't find anything on the cameras to blame it on. Just kids out for a little helling, I guess. John nodded, but it's pretty clear that Wayne couldn't hear the whispers. He didn't get it. Probably never would. He was the perfect one to run something like this, though he would never understand the importance of it, or the horror. The nights John had spent out here had shown him where the missing people were going, had shown him his own fate as well. The whispering would get him one of these nights. It was only a matter of time. John was tired, but the terror made his legs move as the mud sucked at his every step. Maybe tonight was the night. Maybe this would be the night they got him. Maybe this was the night he became a part of Whispering Pines. Even the name had slunk into his consciousness. It was fitting, too fitting, and he could no more outrun it than he could the ground that sucked at his feet. Suddenly the ground did a little more than pull, and John was up to his thighs in the hungry muck. Beneath the soil he could feel the strong grip of searching vines and realized that if he didn't start fighting now, the jig would be up. He yanked and tugged, his strong runner's legs feeling ineffective in the muck. He was losing ground, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and when the paved path came into view, he waited like a drowning man. The roots gripped at him, dragging him back, but John pulled onward, working for the shore. Suddenly, the dirt was up to his hips, and he was wading through the fresh mud. He wasn't going to make it, he thought. The roots would get him, the ground would take him, and he'd be with the dead. One of his nails tore up painfully as he grasped the sidewalk, but he pulled himself up nonetheless. He limped a little as he walked towards the tower, one of his ankles having twisted a little as the root grabbed at him. John's steps weren't just heavy because of the ankle, though. John hadn't gotten a good night's sleep since he opened this damn place. He was exhausted, living off cat naps in his office, or the 4 or 5 hours he snatched a night. John was used to weird sleep schedules, and he had kept strange hours throughout college, but as he got older, it became harder to maintain. He didn't know how much longer he could last like this, and as he came to a familiar placard, he stopped in front of it. His mother's tree was larger than it had any right to be. Seemed larger than it had been this morning, in fact, and the concrete bit at his knees as he dropped down before it. "Mom," he said, tears running down his face. "Mom, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm so tired. I want to rest. I want to..." When his mother's voice shuddered against him, like the caress of a bird's wing, he looked up and saw her. She was lovely, bedecked in leaves and green, the queen of summer in all her glory. When she reached down to touch his face, her hands felt like flowers against his skin. He closed his eyes as he leaned into her touch, her words like summer sun on his skin. "You've done your best, John. Come, rest with us." John nodded, pitching forward as the earth swallowed him up. He should have been terrified, but the embrace felt almost womb-like. It felt so natural, like coming home, and John breathed in a lungful of soil as the darkness enveloped him. "Welcome home," his mother said, and John felt at home. It's my tremendous pleasure to announce the expansion of Whispering Pines Memorial Forest. The park has become less of a memorial and more of a forest in its own right now, and I hope someday to see hundreds of forests like it, instead of useless granite slabs that do nothing but take up space. I know if my friend, John Yomite, or his mother, Terry Yomite, could see how this project had expanded, they would be very proud of the work we've achieved here. I've watched this garden grow into a mighty forest, and I couldn't be more proud to be a part of it. John watched as Wayne spoke to the crowd, telling them about the new backer who was interested in what they were doing here. John understood the words he said, things like the woman's name, Titania Thurston, the Green Society, and Kashmir Botanical Gardens, but they didn't mean anything to him. If someone was interested in his idea, that was good. If they let the forest rot, he supposed that was okay too. John was part of the Whispering Pines woods now, and he supposed that others would be too, very soon. Being a tree was probably the best thing he'd ever experienced, and he was eager to share it with others. Wayne still couldn't hear him, but he would, someday. Some of those in the crowd could clearly hear him, and they'd likely join him too, someday. John had time, after all. He certainly wasn't going anywhere. Smells like the coals might be burning a bit low, and I think that means it's time for our stories to come to an end today. Don't worry, though. I'm sure there'll be plenty of more days with plenty of more tales to come on Cozy Horror. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.